In 1965, a group of 90-odd South African activists traveled to China to receive military training. The group was led by Joe Slovo, a prominent member of the African National Congress, who later became Minister for Housing in Nelson Mandela's government. The South Africans also formed a very close relationship with their Chinese trainers, who taught them about guerrilla warfare tactics and the importance of ideological discipline. The Chinese trainers referred to the South Africans as their little brothers and gave them the nickname the African 90. After completing their training, the South Africans returned to their home country and continued their fight against apartheid. Many of them went on to become leaders in the African National Congress and eventually play a key role in dismantling the apartheid government. This was the very first time that China played a direct role in an armed conflict in the African continent. Cut to today, China is all set to sell armed weapons, drones and fighter jets to Congo, the Democratic Republic of Congo, in its internecine war with Rwanda. According to Africa Intelligence, which is a Paris-based news website, China Aerospace Science and Technology Corporation will soon supply a total of 9 Caihong 4 or CH-4 attack drones to Kinshasa. Remember, the DRC has been stuck in a fratricidal feud with rebels who are backed by neighboring Rwanda. Experts have concerns about these arms transactions between China and the DRC. They fear that these weapons could end up in the wrong hands and further exacerbate the conflict. In recent months, tensions between the DRC and Rwanda have been mounting. Rwanda had shot down a DRC fighter jet in late January over alleged violation of Rwandan airspace. Attempts by the United Nations, the US, and other African countries to try and normalize the situation has so far been unsuccessful. Now, China is stepping in where others have failed. On Crux Decode, will China become the biggest weapons supplier in Africa? From conquering Africa's resources, is China now eyeing local conflicts and the massive weapons market that spawns them? And what can America, which used to be the biggest and singular power broker in this region, do to limit China's plans? The African continent is a gargantuan resource basket for manufacturing powers like the United States and China. The size of the African resource base is so big that America recently declared that Africa will be the go-to destination for America's 50 critical minerals. Now, these 50 critical minerals, many of them are key rare earth minerals that are used in the manufacture of electronics and chips on which much of the world's machines run. Africa is home to around 30% of the world's mineral resources and is a crucial part of the resource strategy both for America and for China. But by pledging to do mining differently, both from how China does it currently and how the West has done mining in the past on the African continent, America is saying that it will help transform African economies. The energy transition in Africa is also an opportunity for the United States for what many are calling an Africa transition. Those were the words used by Amos Hochstein, who is Joe Biden's envoy for energy security. American officials see Africa as helping solve two problems. The first one is a global shortfall in the minerals that are required if the world is to reach its climate change goals. The International Energy Agency reckons that the makers of clean energy technologies will need 40 times more lithium, 25 times more graphite, and about 20 times more nickel and cobalt by 2040 as compared to what was required in 2020. The demand for these rare earth elements, which are basically metals that are used from making wind turbines to solar power plants to fighter jets, they may all be several times higher by the end of the next decade. The second problem that Africa will help solve is China's outsized influence on supply chains. Currently, China refines about 70% of the world's nickel, about 40% of all of the copper in the world, 60% of lithium, and more than 70% of cobalt. These were the findings in a report released by the Brookings Institution back in July. Basically, China has had a free rein for the last 15 years while the rest of the world was sleeping over Africa. Now, this is where the weapon sales comes in. China can use the sale of these weapons to countries like the DRC as leverage to settle its own internecine battles. The West, of course, is reluctant to engage in arms sales to African countries, particularly countries with the kind of checkered record that the DRC has. China, on the other hand, has no such qualms. Beijing may do so in a clandestine fashion, using the conflict as a proxy to provoke and test the reaction of the West, while at the same time also managing to secure a foothold in the weapons market in Africa. According to the Stockholm International Peace Research Institute, SIPRI, China has delivered over 250 combat drones to more than a dozen countries around the world just in the last decade. This makes China the world's top seller of weaponized unmanned aerial vehicles, or UAVs. In comparison, in that same 10-year period, the United States, which has the most advanced UAV technology in the world, has shipped only 12 combat drones, all of which have gone either to France or to the UK. The Chinese drones are substantially cheaper than the US drones in the same category, and they likely come with less questions asked. But most importantly, analysts say that countries are turning to China because of export controls that have been imposed by the United States. The Missile Technology Control Regime, or the MTCR, is an agreement that was created in the 1980s to prohibit the spread of platforms that are capable of chemical, biological, or nuclear weapons delivery. It limits Washington and its ability to sell combat drones. Going beyond drones, the SIPRI report says that in the last decade, Chinese arms sales in sub-Saharan Africa were second only to Russia, almost 3 times more than the amount exported by the United States. Russia still continues to be the top arms supplier to Africa. About a quarter of all weapons on the African continent that have been imported are imported from Russia. China is not too far behind, with a little more than a fifth. The United States' share of the African weapons market is in single digits. China maintains significant sway over the mining industry, particularly in countries like the DRC. In fact, in the Congo, China controls nearly 70% of all of the DRC's mining portfolio. This gives Beijing a vested interest in a country that happens to be a major exporter to China. The current leadership of the Congo has been actively renegotiating Chinese contracts, showing that the government is committed to reducing Beijing's influence, much of which is the legacy of former President Joseph Kabila. Since taking office in 2019, President Felix Tshisekedi has sought to balance his country's relationship with both China and the United States. And in keeping with that, in December of last year, the DRC signed a memorandum of understanding with the United States on the development of electrical vehicle batteries. But its trade with China is so huge, and with the US so far behind, it will likely take time to catch up. It's not just drones that China is pitching. It is also committing to sell the JF-17 Thunder multi-role combat aircraft. This aircraft was jointly developed by China and Pakistan. Currently, the DRC's air fleet is dominated by Russian-made Sukhoi 25s. Now, with the sanctions regime kicking in after the Russia-Ukraine war, Russia is increasingly finding it difficult to service its existing aircraft that have been sold to countries like the DRC. Also, the aircraft that was shot down by Rwanda back in January was a Sukhoi 25, and that has led to questions in the DRC on the capabilities and efficiencies of Russian aircraft. Russia's invasion of Ukraine is opening up opportunities for China to sell weapons to the African continent. China, like I said, has become the second largest supplier of weapons to Africa, but its sales are largely restricted to 5 out of the 50-odd countries that make up the African continent. Clearly, Russia's troubles have become China's opportunity, fueling Africa's weapons market.